All right, wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us for HRAI's Tariffs. What now? We saw the big announcement, and now we're here to talk about it. First of all, I would like to thank ORAC, the Ontario Refrigeration and Air Conditioning Contractors Association, for co-sponsoring this important webinar and the previous ones about the tariff. This is one of a series of covering the tariffs on the HVAC industry, and we will keep you updated as much as we can. With that being said, we are joined today by some familiar faces: Martin Luymes, Sandy McLeod with HRAI, as well as Alex Greco with the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. He's going to provide us a perspective from them, and Hugh Williams, President of Impact Public Affairs. We got a pretty packed agenda, and as before, we will have time for questions, so you can put those at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a chat button. Put them in the main chat or the Q&A. I know Sandy's going to be monitoring those, answering what we can, and we'll get to those we can't after the fact as well. But first of all, just a quick look at what we're going to discuss today. Introduction, that's what I'm doing now. My name's Matt Bradford. I'm the HRAI webinar host. And then we're going to go to Alex for a Chamber of Commerce perspective, followed by Hugh with political views and reactions, then Martin with HR actions, and then, like I mentioned, the Q&A. But first, what did we all witness yesterday? Maybe I'll invite Martin on for a second to distill this into two very professional images that we can kind of demonstrate what we all saw yesterday in the Rose Garden.
Thanks, Matt. We've been kind of waiting. In fact, when I talked to Lauren about organizing this session just last week, I guess, I said, well, we don't know yet what we're going to talk about. And he said, well, we're going to have something to talk about. And almost certainly we knew we would, and we do. But what we really thought was that this was going to be an all-out attack on Canada. And if there's one finding from yesterday's Rose Garden press conference, it was more like this. It wasn't an attack on Canada as much was the rest of the world. The United States has basically declared, it would seem, economic war on or trade war on the entire rest of the planet, not just Canada. So in fact, sifting through the tea leaves, what the impacts are in Canada are still being sorted through. Obviously, all of this will have an effect on Canada, but in terms of immediate new tariff information, it's still coming in as we speak. Canada's response is still being formed as we speak. So we have a few people on the call today who can speak to that, and then I'll wrap up towards the end with what next actions we might take as HRAI.
Thank you so much, Martin. So with that said, let's get Alex Greco on, Senior Director of Manufacturing and Value Chains with the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Alex has the perspective that we're looking for. Alex, how are you? You've got your mic on. Oh, there we go.
I'm good, thanks, man. And thank you, and to Martin and the rest of the HRAI team for inviting me here today. So I thought I would just, at a very high level, outline the perspective of what we heard yesterday, and then talk about what the implications for Canada, the world, what it means, what are some of the uncertainties, and to summarize where we are now and where we're looking to go moving forward. Next slide, please.
Are you able to share that in presenter mode, just so viewers can get the full
I was
frame?
just going to ask that question, whether or not we were in the right version. Let me just switch here.
All good.
Confirm we're good.
It takes a couple seconds to update here. Not yet on my end.
Yeah, not on my end either.
Okay, it's showing on mine that I did the swap, but let me see if I can try that again. What do we got now?
Fortunately, not yet. Is there a present in Teams maybe, or view?
I've swapped it twice now, so
yeah. Okay, well, at risk,
I can keep going. It's
yeah.
Okay.
It is showing in presentation, someone says, so maybe it's just on our... Either way, let's get to the information. Sure.
Yep, so we can go to the next slide. Not coming up on my end. Okay, I will just talk, and then we can go from there. So I think yesterday, Canada, with the overall world, I think woke up to a reality that Canada's been living for months. I mean, there's businesses around the world have faced a lot of uncertainty, and even though Canada largely was spared for the most part yesterday, with the exception of auto and steel and aluminum, which I'll get into later, there is going to be an after effect. as to what is happening. There will be difficult times ahead. I think there is a few things that I think to be aware of. And one, in terms of the overall, landscape right now, we see that there is a universal import tariff, 10% on all U.S. imports. And there are reciprocal tariffs on specific countries. That includes the EU, Japan, China, Vietnam, and Cambodia. But there's still, with the automobile tariffs on all imported automobiles and certain auto parts, there are after effects. We are seeing that now with what Stellantis announced with their 2-week shutdown. We have seen other parts of the auto sector concerned in terms of what this might mean in terms of what parts are ultimately included. What does that mean in terms of the overall integrated supply chains? And then we still have the steel and aluminum tariffs that remain of 25% that was announced a few weeks back. So there's a lot, there's still, yes, Canada was sort of spared, but there's still a lot of concerns and headwinds that we need to look at. Next slide. So in terms of the uncertainties and concerns, I think there's 3 key things. One is what the potential retaliation could look like. And that's dealing with what other countries might do in terms of countermeasures as a result of the global reciprocal tariffs that were announced on many countries. And for Canada, what do they do in response to what has continued to happen on auto, steel, and aluminum? Secondly, is the economic impact. And we're seeing, I mean, there's been ongoing conversations around what it might mean in terms of cost for consumer prices, production costs, what it'll mean for inflation, for the overall economy, a potential recession, what it'll mean in terms of just the overall cost of doing business in Canada. And I'm hearing from a lot of our members that they are putting a pause on potential expansions or upgrades that they were trying to do, not only for overall facilities, but whether that meant for machinery, equipment, technology adoption, and other processes that they were looking to introduce. And there is some consideration in terms of what this eventually might mean in terms of future job losses, downsizing, and what they do in terms of how they do business in Canada overall. The third thing is around global trade relations. And there's been ongoing uncertainty in terms of what the 2026 Kuzma review, or as I like to say, the renegotiation. But what happens when we do with other countries, whether it's the Indo-Pacific, whether it's the EU, whether it's India, other agreements that we have and other partnerships that we're moving forward right now. And I think, there's been this whole conversation around trade diversification and how to diversify markets, but that's something that you can't do overnight. That's a long process. And while there's been ongoing conversations by some companies to try to look at alternative suppliers, and EDC, Export Development Canada, has tried to offer different supports through their trade commissioner services and other things. There's still a lot more questions and answers. Moreover, I'll add that, there's been a number of business support packages that were announced, the $5 billion from EDC. A couple of weeks ago, Prime Minister Carney announcing potential business supports, like corporate tax deferrals, for example, and then if he's elected, to eliminate all internal trade barriers with the Canada Free Trade Agreement. That's all positive, but there's still nothing has been implemented, and there's still a lack of a lot of details. So what businesses are able to do in terms of relief is a challenge right now. And so that creates further uncertainty in terms of cash flow and liquidity issues for the business community. Next slide, please. And so when we look at the overall impact on Canada, there's the market reactions. We've seen everything that's happened in the stock market in the United States, what's happened, in Asia and here in Canada. We've had conversations with our economics and data team here at the chamber now. That could mean in terms of declining in stock futures, what I mean for oil prices, and then how does that feed into into interest rates, inflation, and overall on consumer spending overall. And so that is all fluctuating as we speak. And then you have the inflationary pressures just because of the increased cost of goods, and given the fact that raw materials and other parts and different components that are made to make manufactured goods that are all impacted, and that's a risk of a global shutdown, and what that means for economic growth at a time where we've seen over the last several months, and even years declining investment, increased regulatory burden, and other obstacles to invest and grow here in Canada. And if we go on the next slide here, this slide will really speak to the uncertainty that we're facing right now. If you look at 2020 with COVID, I mean, that was a time where it was uncertain. We didn't know what was going to happen in terms of the economy, what some of the impacts would be in terms of what business supports, like the wage subsidy program, CEBA loans, other support measures that federal and provincial governments announced to help get us through the crisis. How would that all work? And in our latest estimate by our business data lab, I mean, we're even now higher in terms of the uncertainty than we did in COVID, for all the different reasons that I mentioned, but then also in terms of we don't know what's happening day to day, and when the president could, hey, we accept one day, another thing could change. And so simply put, volatility is the new certainty, and it's obviously driving conversations as it relates to what does this mean in terms of trying to get our house in order in Canada in terms of lower taxation, reducing red tape, building new infrastructure, to name a few examples. Next slide. And then this slide here just shows the magnified impact on Canada, and going through where we was already high with Trump 1.0 in terms of the economic policy uncertainty, and with Trump 2.0, we're getting right up there right now. And so that's even increasing even more. And when we looked at Trump 1.0, we had the initial steel and aluminum tariffs with Section 232. And now just with everything that's happening right now, just because there was a temporary reprieve today, that doesn't mean that the uncertainty is decreased. It actually increases overall right now. Next slide, please. And so as we look for considerations, I think there are three things that we need to be able to keep in mind. One, yes, Canada is initially exempt, but the indirect impacts will be seen. And because of just how integrated our supply chains are, how much business we do with other countries, where manufacturers and other businesses get their parts, their processes, the type of trading relationships where they get their materials to manufacture different products, there is going to be a ripple effect in terms of what it means for cost of doing business, but how it impacts where companies ship and get their products from different regions of the world. Secondly, with economic sectors, I mean, automotive and manufacturing is, at the top of the list, but there's also other effects in terms of agriculture, dairy, pharmaceuticals, medical devices, healthcare, to name a few examples of economic sectors that are going to be impacted. But that also now leads to what the policy response is going to be. Are there going to be counter tariffs? Or is this going to spring into, negotiations of CUSMA? Will we get there faster? There's a very fine balancing act that the government has to consider, just because of, how sensitive the supply chain is, but also what it can mean in terms of small businesses across the country. I mean, for example, there was a 21-day consultation that had just concluded right on April 2nd regarding the second counter tariff list. I mean, and as a business organization, we received hundreds of inquiries in terms of what HS codes would be affected, companies asking for exemptions, putting forward remissions requests, etc. And so that is being factored in terms of what the government needs to do going forward to try to protect industry, but also not have any unintended consequences. But the reality is there are going to be unintended consequences, regardless right now. And so I'll move to the final slide. And so to summarize right now where we're at, it is going to be a difficult year for Canadian businesses. And we are waiting to see what the Prime Minister is going to announce in terms of other supports, what the response could be. There's still a lot of unanswered questions around what some of the elements of the auto tariff could look like in terms of what parts are, exempt. I mean, are there going to be more shutdowns? What is this going to mean for the overall economy? And that leads to extreme uncertainty, more disruptions, confidence plummeting, investments on pause, and we are at an inflection point. And so there is going to need to be bold policy responses to make our economy more dynamic and resilient. And that ties into not only some of the short-term measures that the Prime Minister has announced, but also a lot of the bold policy measures regarding taxation, regulatory reform that I mentioned, but then also how does that feed into building a robust advanced manufacturing sector that secures Canada's economic future. But I think it's important to really stress that things can't be undone overnight. Our supply chains are integrated with the US, and so there's a very fine balancing act between the whole conversation still around Buy Canada and then what will we do with business with the US, because that is something that business is still not going away anytime soon, even though we are having these challenges with the United States right now. So Martin and team, thanks again for inviting me, and I'll pause there.
Alex, there was a question on China, whether the tariff levels are 34% or 54%. That reports have been confusing. Can you speak at all to some of the issues surrounding China?
Sorry, you cut out there.
Oh, sorry. So question is,
Yep.
China tariffs on imports into the US, 34% or 54%? Reports have been confusing. Do you have any insight on that?
So my understanding right now is China would be hit with a 34% tariff on top of the 20% that he imposed earlier this year. So that would bring the total new levies to 54% and closer to a 60% figure that he actually had threatened on the campaign trail. And I think it's important to note that Chinese exporters, like many other economies around the world, will face that 10% baseline tariff as part of the new 34% levy that's been issued on China. And that's dealing with almost all goods shipped to the world's largest consumer economy in with the United States, but then also how that feeds into how it'll feed into the overall economic impact. So that's my understanding right now. I think there's still some of the details that need to still be worked out, and we're monitoring it pretty closely.
There's another question, which Alex, you may or may not have an ability to answer. We might have to do some digging afterwards. And this is the question about tariffs have been collected now for a few weeks. How are they being accounted for within the federal government with assurances that they're being used to help Canadian businesses and not necessarily just going into general tax revenue?
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer, but I know that CBSA has been looking at measures to account for and had some process in places to collect the revenue. As far as what we know in terms of where the revenue is going and where it's being allocated right now, that's the government, from my conversations, has been pretty vague on that at this point. There might be some more details to come, but I would probably say I'd have to take that back more to see if I've heard anything further. And so I'm happy to go back offline. I know there's a call that's happening, I think either today or tomorrow on the forum on Canada. Actually, I think it's Friday. Actually, yeah, it is Friday, around the forum on Canada-U.S. issues that Global Affairs of Finance hosts, and so I'm happy to bring that up to get some additional details. But that is my understanding as of right now.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
No problem.
I see a lot of questions pouring in. We are doing a Q&A session, and I'm sure Sandy is also getting to those as much as he can.
Yeah, so move on with Hugh, and there's a couple of these that I will answer directly.
Thank you so much. You are the man, Hugh, and you see him on the screen. We're going to move into political views and reactions with Hugh Williams, President of Impact Public Affairs. Hugh, take it away.
Matt, thank you for having us on. And Matt, you have a career as a TV host if the web business doesn't work out for you. Listen, I think that there's a real monumental shift in the global trading order. So as Canada, it's not just us; it's about the rest of the world. And in the next slide, dealing with the actual announcement from the Rose Garden yesterday. If we move to the next slide, where the president and his whole approach to tariffs has really, I would say, fundamentally, not just changed how the world deals with it, but of course, Canada is front and center with that reaction. I think one of the things to look for in yesterday's announcement with the president was how little foreshadowing there was done with respect to the president's approach. Usually, if you have a big trade announcement, a big financial announcement, a centerpiece announcement, what you try to do in that instance is do a pre-briefing with media, have a media lockup, have a stakeholder lockup, share with your trading partners what to expect, so that the media is ready to respond to it as they go out. And what we saw instead was something straight out of a reality TV show where reporters had no idea. And government officials were like the rest of us, sitting watching television to see what would indeed come out. And I can tell you, the Prime Minister's office, the embassy in the States, were all in the same boat, trying to figure out exactly what the math would be on this. In terms of how Canadians feel about this, I think the next slide, it's, you can see it in the streets, you can see it in boardrooms, in business decisions. You certainly see it in some of the public polling, but certainly in terms of the internal polling that I've seen. Alex referenced the uncertainty of Canadian business, but it's really a high level of uncertainty from Canadians, but also a high degree of anger and a high degree of patriotism. And I think we may look back on this period in grand historical terms to a real moment of Canadian unity and a rising consensus that we have to be able to build the country economically to be able to deal more effectively with a trading partner that's unreliable. And it is quite remarkable that we have all of the major parties talking about building infrastructure, making it easy to build an economy. We now have provinces of Quebec and Alberta cooperating on the concept of a pipeline across the country. And I think anybody in the construction world, HRAI's members, as we talk about building Canada in a more competitive way, that's one of the silver linings in all of this, where there will be real opportunities for us to charge forward going forward as a sector. And I would also say this is probably the most important time to recognize how important your association is. At times like this, you have a voice not just here in Canada, in Ottawa. You have a voice across the country in the provincial capitals, and you have a voice in the United States through our U.S. Offices, and of course the connection with the embassy down in the States. So what is happening in the States? I've spent a lot of time down in Washington over the last little while. We had a remarkable rebuke of the president that took place last night, where for the first time the Democrats really started to come out publicly in the Senate and talk about this is insanity for us to go after Canada. There was a small group of Republicans who joined the Democrats in voting against the Trump tariff agenda, and really most of that was not focused on the world agenda, but it was really focused on the Canadian tariffs and the fact that Canada is the US's largest customer. And I think as Canadians, we also have to remember that our battle is not with the average everyday American or even our American customers, our American counterparts, our American suppliers, but it is with the direction that this administration has decided to take. And for a long time, it seemed like there were no allies in Washington, or none that were willing to step forward. But this is a significant crack that we've seen with Congress waking up to the fact that this is impacting their districts. We're seeing layoffs. We're seeing, obviously stock market interactions. These are important. I would also say that, Alex showed the Trump 1.0. In the first administration, trade groups were very vocal about the North American impact, the impacts of tariffs on Canada. This time around, because of the nature of the fact that they control the House and the Senate, as well as the White House, much less dissent from trade groups talking about this, much more of a wait and see attitude in terms of not wanting to pop their heads up and be the target of administration criticism. So in the same way that Congress has been more quiet, trade groups who typically would be more active in Washington have been quiet, but that's changed in the last 2 or 3 weeks. I can tell you that there's a powerful group of trade associations who are now on a pro-growth agenda and saying, let's not play defense with tariffs. Let's talk about building pro-growth across North America, and that's gathering some steam, which is again good news in Washington. Our trade officials in the embassy are working hard. We know the embassy is engaged. they felt a lot at sea in the next little while, but I think they are quite content that even though yesterday is not a good day for the world economy, and certainly not a good day for the Canadian economy, it is much less bad than it could be, to use the vernacular. So things could have been much worse, and in a lot of ways, the fact that Canada was relatively unscathed the way other countries were hit, and that there was a recognition of USMCA is an important recognition. And I would say auto has got a lot of attention in terms of the 25% auto tariff, but it's important to remember that as part of that auto tariff, it's 25%, but it's only 25% on the non-US component. So an average vehicle built in Canada has 50% American content, so that tariff is only 12.5%. And I think an important signal as well coming out of today and dealing with the Prime Minister's office yesterday and today on this is that the retaliatory measures we've taken on automotive here in Canada don't include parts, and they also don't include non-USMCA compliant. So effectively, it's about a 12% retaliatory tariff as well. So there's a recognition on both sides of the border, at least in the auto world, that it's still a problem, and is not a good. We should be going back to the USMCA baseline rules. But that both sides have avoided kind of the nuclear option of doubling down and making things worse. So there's lots of progress there, and I think signals that there can be some sensibility in terms of response on both sides of the border going forward. Certainly, Premier Ford has been tremendously active in DC. Their representatives were claiming victory last night, and certainly in private conversations and then publicly later on, they feel good about where they are. And there's a greater engagement, as I say, of North American partnerships to talk about what's going on. So some good signs coming out of the States that I just wanted to share with all of you, despite the large rhetoric. So in terms of the polling, what that's done for Canada, the next slide really shows kind of the poll tracker situation. And no, this is not a heart monitor, but it is a historic change in how Canada views the Liberal Party. It's never happened before. We have a governing party go down to 20% in the polls, as they were in January. Have a almost 2-year-long gap where they trailed by 10 to 20 points, and then make a miraculous change of leadership and be able to now be solidly in first place. I think that alone speaks to the dynamic of the Canada-US relationship and Canadians trying to figure out who is best placed to manage the economy. And I think it's caught the Conservatives, certainly in the early days of their campaign, flat-footed with respect to staying on the message track of Canada is broken, as opposed to responding to things more broadly. So you can see the Liberal uptick there to now pass the Conservatives. And one of the big stories, if you look at the NDP line going down, as you see in this slide, they're at 8% overall, which is the next slide, Martin, just shows that they've dropped off the map. Their natural place is 21%. So to lose 11%, almost all of it going to the Liberals, shows that there's a consolidation of views going forward in terms of the vote. And of course, the bloc vote in Quebec has also similarly collapsed. So you're looking at seat projections of around 193 seats for the Liberals, 125 for the Conservatives, and then just kind of a cleanup of 17 and 7 seats for the NDP, and could get worse. Again, these are projections at a moment in time, as opposed to a prediction of what could happen in the future. But I will note that the important thing about this is that it has shifted the dynamic, and now things get very, very complicated for stakeholders, because as a nonpartisan organization, we've got to be talking to all of the parties about their policy. And you can see now that almost every presentation by, whether it's the NDP, the Bloc, the Liberals, or the Conservatives, are all talking about how they'll react to trade, which I think is important. So again, the seat breakdown I'll just show you there is quite remarkable, and I think is for the next slide, if I could, Martin, shows you as it sits today how divided the country could be in terms of seats, in terms of the blue regions, the vote being over projected in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and British Columbia for the Conservatives, and how much we could have a divided country at a time when we need to be somewhat united. But a lot of days left in the campaign where, I'm a believer that campaigns matter, so we'll have to see how this all plays out. But one of the things we're seeing in private polling, and again in public polling, is why Canadians are making this decision, why there's been such a turnaround. One of the things that we have to see in that, of course, is the next slide, which gives the Canadians' take on who makes better dealing with Trump. Clearly, Canadians at this point in time are leaning towards Mark Carney on that. And then in the next slide that you look at who's going to be tougher with Trump, you've got 44% of Canadians think that that Carney will strongly oppose Trump, where only 27% feel that way about Pierre Poilievre. That's going to be a ballot question. It's going to be interesting in terms of how those two leaders deal with it on the debate stage. And in the next slide, you can see the preferred choice for Prime Minister being reflected in those other things. And again, we're not picking winners and losers here. We're not telling anybody who to vote for or not vote for, but it's important as part of this process that we get HRAI's view out there. And later this week, we're going to be launching HRAI's election platform, which we want all parties to adopt going forward. And that's going to take place here in Ottawa. Next slide I can show you is, a little bit of how the Liberals have managed this. It has been, U.S. trade has been the central point of their campaign. The Prime Minister enjoys a incumbency advantage that when he's been able to pause his campaign, he draws the attention back to Ottawa in cabinet meetings. So he has that advantage in terms of being able to frame the issue as an incumbent. And I think it's also fair to say he's taken a more strategic approach. The former Prime Minister Trudeau was dollar for dollar hit back. And I think even as you see automotive, even if you see other industries come forward, there's certainly a greater degree of consultation and deliberation on how Canada could react to that. I think in terms of the Conservatives, it was interesting again that their dream scenario in terms of a majority government seems to be over, although I wouldn't rule them out for a transition to government. And they have tipped now towards pivoting to Trump and trade in a very influential speech that Pierre Poilievre gave this morning in Kingston, which really laid out his response and was on a track with what the message of today of the media was the automotive tariffs, announcing in this particular case of cutting the GST on Canadian-made new vehicles. And of course, not to be outdone, all the other leaders have leaned into this as well. Jagmeet Singh out talking about victory bonds, protecting workers, and laws to stop companies from moving out of Canada to the U.S. I think one of the more interesting plays, of course, is the Bloc Québécois, who are fighting for relevance. You saw in the polling numbers there how they've dropped off precipitously compared to if an election had been held last fall. They're really making the argument that supply management is important, give us the balance of power, and that Quebec should be represented at the trade deadline. So all of the parties have clearly pivoted to talk about trade, and it is still going to be the number one issue that we deal with going forward. The trick for HRAI is for us to be out there talking about our issues, framing not just the U.S.-Canada response, but what we need to see out of the government overall. This time, interestingly enough, there was some thought that neither party, a major party, would launch a formal campaign platform. We're told now by all the campaigns that they will be launching platforms. So that, again, will give us an opportunity to plug in our advocacy asks on behalf of the sector and also to do some analysis on where those parties are going. So I'll pause there and then take questions at the end with Martin and Alex.
Thank you so much, Hugh. A lot of stuff to digest. And Martin's right on cue. I will let him take it off. HRAI's engagement on tariffs. What's going on?
All right, thanks, Matt, and thanks, Hugh, for that quick overview. I'm going to start actually by addressing a question that came up in the Q&A from an anonymous participant about whether or not Canada is going to impose tariffs on heating and cooling products coming into Canada. My observation would be the manufacturers have been keenly on top of this issue and paying attention to precisely what products are in and what products aren't. We're starting to hear a lot of conversation among wholesalers now about the trickle-down effects on them in terms of impacts on their inventories and who pays what and when, and reimbursement questions, and which I'll cover in a minute. And now I think we're hearing more from contractors who are actually feeling the brunt. So this is a little bit of a trickle-down set of impacts through the distribution channel. And so these questions are coming up now, some of which have been answered in previous webinars. We've done, I think this is number 5 or maybe number 6, and through our various communiques. There, to remind everyone, in the first round after the February one announcements from the president about the tariffs on Canada, 25% tariffs, there was an immediate response from the Canadian government on $50 billion worth of trade. No, sorry, 30 billion. I think I got that number wrong. And that was immediate and going to come into effect. It ended up being postponed for various reasons, which I won't cover. But in that first round, HVAC products were, for the most part, exempt. And that was a request that we made of the government on January 31st. We'd like to believe they paid attention to our request and exempted HVACR products because of their essential nature in Canada and because of, in some cases, the lack of alternative choices available to Canadians to products coming out of the US. So products were exempt in that first round, but at that time, they also announced a second round of tariffs that would be imposed starting right about now, on the expectation that these would be done in response to an more aggressive move by the US. That round, there was a round of consultation that Alex referred to, a 21-day period of consultation on that, which many, many members I know would have made submissions on. The list of products included amounted to trade up to $125 billion on products coming into Canada, and HVACR products were on the list. Many products were on the list. So members, companies were of all types, not just in our sector, but across the country, across all sectors, had an opportunity to comment directly to Finance Canada on whether the products of their industry should be included or not, and at what level. So it was a pretty tailored consultation process, very direct, fairly straightforward. The only thing that was really required is for any company to be fully aware of what the tariff codes are that apply to their products, and then to make a case for why those products should be exempted. And the rationale, the primary rationale that was offered, that was kind of offered as a factor for consideration was, are there substitutes, readily available substitutes for the product? So the product category we always talk about is Kentucky bourbon. As much as people might like Kentucky bourbon, there are plenty of substitutes for that product in the Canadian market. So that's an easy one for Canada to tariff on products coming into Canada because it exacts pain in the US while minimizing, relatively speaking, the impact on Canadians. Products of our sector are harder to consider because for the most part, they are essential to life in Canada. And in many cases, there aren't really easily available substitutes. So that burden of 25% tariffs will be passed on directly to end users. Turning to that, so as I mentioned in previous webinars, we outlined what the process is for companies to make a submission of their own. HRAI didn't make a broad submission other than the initial January 31st announcement we made in Ottawa, which is if retaliatory tariffs are going to be considered, we suggested that Canada should exempt the products of our sector for the reasons I stated, being essential to life in Canada. And that got a lot of quite positive reaction, both within our industry and from the media and from Canadians. More recently, because furnaces were on that list in the round 2 of $125 billion worth of retaliatory tariffs, a group of our manufacturers came to us and said, we'd like to see exclusions or modifications in the policy for those products. Their request was we couldn't just assume that we had consensus among all manufacturers. In fact, we knew we don't have consensus. So the request was brought forward, considered, brought to our manufacturers board and then to the HRAI board. And at the end, they endorsed that submission, and we made that submission that furnaces ought to be exempted. Again, the reason being the vast majority of furnaces coming into the country are sourced from the United States. There are very few alternatives. So this would be a clear imposition of hardship on Canadian households at a time, on a product that really you can't live without, and at a time when there's all kinds of other hardships. So we'll see whether that submission gets consideration. We don't know. We fully expected that the Canadian response that we might hear later today, maybe, I don't know that it was ready to go. It clearly wasn't ready to go last night. whether or not Canada will retaliate with tariffs other than those on the automotive sector, which have already been announced. So we have to wait and see. It also opens the door. I'm going to say my sense is, even though that consultation period, the 21-day consultation period, is closed, they extended it by a day to yesterday, but it's now closed. That members can continue to request of HRAI. Certainly, members can make their own submissions directly to the federal government when the opportunity arises, if they reopen that consultation. But they can also ask of us. Just earlier this week, we had a conversation with some manufacturers about exempting chillers on the same grounds. There's very few alternatives to US sourced products. We didn't get that one in on time, though I suspect the companies who are affected will have made their own submissions to the federal government. But we will continue to hear from members and take advice on what other products ought to be included in the exclusions list or exemptions list. More recently, as I mentioned, we've heard from some wholesalers about specific concerns, and part of, I guess, as Hugh said, this is a good time to be part of HRAI so that we can take these concerns forward in aggregate on behalf of the whole sector. We are in contact with Finance Canada and are getting pretty good responses on some of these questions. So I have to imagine the people at Finance Canada who are responsible for this process are drinking from a fire hose. They're getting thousands of requests from companies and from industry groups representing those companies across the country. We're a relatively small industry compared to some others, and I have no doubt that they're having to deal with a huge volume of questions about how things are supposed to be administered. I know in the Q&A I saw some questions about where's the money going, how is this being handled. I'm going to say this is all happening in real time. This is not something that the government has been planning for years and years. They don't even have the infrastructure to manage this right now. They're going to have to build an infrastructure. This is not something that was done with deliberation. This is being done in reaction. The question has come up in the US as well, just as a side note, at a time when the civil service is being gutted from the top down. Who will manage the process on the US side of the border, not just with Canada, but with the multitude of other countries they're going to be imposing tariffs on? Who will manage that process at a time when the civil service is being dramatically downsized? So that's a question for the US to worry about. We'll try to deal with what we can influence here in Canada. So this question came up, whether or not, if tariffs are lifted, which is always possible, considering, as was pointed out by Alex, the uncertainty that we're seeing on information coming out of the White House. From one day to the next, we don't really know what's going to happen next. So it's quite possible in a week's time. I think it's unlikely now, but it's possible that all of this will go away. That the president might say, if we only just renegotiate the USMCA, that will be our way to getting a better arrangement in place. That's possible. But wholesalers were asking, what happens if tariffs are lifted and we've paid all these costs and have to carry that and won't be able to pass them on, being the in-between stage between the supplier, the manufacturer, and the contractor? What happens if we're hanging on to product that we can't charge the full price on? And the response from Finance Canada was very understanding and very sympathetic. And really the response, in a nutshell, this is a paraphrase, it's not their actual wording, but basically they're saying we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. They do not have an immediate solution to offer at this time. So that's for those wholesalers on the call who might be wondering about some of those questions. The second one that came up is what happens under cases where products fail under warranty and they're returned, then destroyed per current practice, and wholesalers have no clear path to recover the tariff that they paid on those units, even though the product is never fully used or sold. The response from Finance Canada is that there is a process that these goods might qualify for duty drawback under what they call the obsolete and surplus goods program. There is a memo. We can share that link. I think it will be shared with our wholesaler members who are asking in due course. I passed this on to the wholesalers division, and their suggestion was to determine what what's eligible for those duty drawbacks, to contact customs brokers or the Canada Border Services Agency, CBSA. Okay, so that's just a sample of 2 questions that have come forward from wholesalers. We're going to start getting questions from contractors, I believe, who are dealing with now the consequences that they're facing. Okay, so we'll take those on as they come. Other actions that HRAI has been doing over the last few weeks is, one, I'll say we continue to respond to member concerns as they arise. We will continue to engage with larger industry groups like the Chamber. You heard from Alex, and we're in regular communication with them and the actions that they're proposing or are enacting at a higher level for a much broader range of industries. And the Canadian manufacturers and exporters who have their own view. Some of you have been on previous calls with Ryan from the CME, where they shared their positioning on some of these questions. So we'll keep engaged with them. We'll aid members as necessary in the remissions request process. I'll cover that a little bit. This is not something we have a lot of internal expertise on as yet, but the federal government did put in place a remissions process, which basically means if a company is impacted by tariffs and can make a case that they have reason to be relieved of that burden, there's an application, a process for that. And they have indicated to us that an industry association like HRAI may, if it chooses to, make requests on a broad category of products as opposed to companies making their own individual requests. But the first step is for companies to make their own direct request. There's a whole template. It's not straightforward. There's a lot of documentation required to make the case. I'm going to guess some companies on the call might have already started this process themselves, or at least become familiar with the process. HRAI might play a role, and we've been invited by Finance Canada to play a role in helping our members with that process as necessary. Beyond that, we have had to deal with the unique perspective of Canadian producers within our membership who don't necessarily support all the positioning around exemptions, who feel there's a need to provide some form of protection for Canadian-based producers, companies that produce in Canada or are owned by Canadians. And so though they are a minority in our overall membership, we feel the need to engage with them, hear their concerns, and find solutions to their to the challenges that they're facing. We have in the last month, I guess about a month and a half ago, we formed a group called the Canadian Council of Manufacturers, or the Council of Canadian Manufacturers rather. And they will be meeting again. I think we've set a date of April 17th, but that invitation hasn't gone out yet, to follow up and talk about these concerns, to engage with the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters group, to talk with Finance Canada about some unique provisions for relief, and to make a case to the Canadian government, as many other Canadian industry associations are doing, for the Canadian government to provide a stronger form of support directly to Canadian manufacturers, not necessarily in the form of tariffs, but in the form of encouraging investment in production here in Canada. Reducing interprovincial trade barriers is one example of a benefit that could be created, but there are many others, and we're starting to explore those with the federal government. We're also, I mentioned this in a previous webinar, we just started to have some very high level, not very detailed discussions with European allies, European associations who see an opportunity to strengthen trade relationships between Canada and Europe as an alternative to Canada's reliance and almost, singular connection to the United States. This is not something we've made any commitment to as yet, but it is a discussion that will be very interesting, and it's very consistent with the positioning that's been taken by almost all parties in the federal running for leadership that basically argue that Canada should diversify its trade relationships beyond the United States. As Prime Minister Carney said not long ago, the relationship with the United States has forever changed. We'll see if that's really true, but one consequence of that is we need to foster and build relationships with others. That will apply to our sector as well. There are lots and lots of products coming out of the US, out of the European Union that aren't available in Canada. And there's obviously an interest from companies in that world to explore a tighter relationship with the market here. And finally, we'll continue to inform our members, you all, of new developments as they arise. And as I mentioned at the start, when and if concerns come forward, we'll take those forward as necessary to the federal government. Hugh mentioned that we'll be sharing a platform document with the various parties contesting the election federally. That policy platform, which we're just working on right now, the final wording, will build on asks that we've made of the federal government over the last several years around a variety of themes that most people will be familiar with, that are near and dear to the hearts of our industry, around workforce development, around engaging on energy efficiency programs, on carbon reduction, and things like red tape reduction, a variety of different topics. Added to that list now is the positioning we've taken on the tariffs question. So we're going to engage with all parties on that. We're going to, Hugh and his team at Impact Public Affairs will be doing a review of the various party platforms, and we'll share that with our membership once completed to inform companies within our membership on where the various parties stand in relation to our sector. So those are some of the activities we've been involved in. Hopefully, in the process, I answered the question that came forward. There might be some other questions, so we're going to go now to Q&A, either for anything that I've said or any of the other speakers.
There's a couple here that I want to toss back out. One for Alex, and this is the issue of bonded shipping. So products coming in from Mexico, or I guess anywhere else, if they are shipped through the US but direct to Canada, can you confirm that they would not be implicated by the US tariffs or the Canadian counter tariffs?
My understanding is it would not be impacted.
Okay, perfect. And that's what we've heard consistently.
Yes.
I believe we had a piece in our newsletter a few weeks ago as well about that. So I just wanted to confirm that one. The other question, and maybe it's an Alex or a Hugh, where can stakeholders get detailed information on what's considered CUSMA compliant?
Yeah, I mean, that's like the $1 million question to try to get that nailed down, because it's different for every sector. But perhaps we can take that one away and provide a couple of links to resources to members to look for. And every manufacturer, every importer is now going through those challenges, particularly in those industries where we've been told that you have to be USMCA compliant. So we'll take that under advisement. I think there's 2 or 3 resources that I can think of that would be helpful. Alex, do you have anything on that you want to add?
I think, and apologies, my camera's been disabled by the host, but I think the other thing too is any detailed information will be available tomorrow. I know the Forum on Canada-US issues that Global Affairs Canada and Finance Canada is doing the calls I mentioned earlier, and so they'll have some details on that call in terms of what is compliant, what's not, what is being going to be affected. So I'm happy to share anything I hear on that call, Hugh and Martin, as well as there's a couple other resources as well that we've put together here at the chamber with some information. So I'll follow up with everyone afterwards.
Yeah, we'll
Okay,
send it. I think we'll share that with all members, because I think there's
yes,
members that are on
I
the
think
call.
I think watch our newsletter for those types of things. So there's a few things here we'll take away that we'll follow up with, and that is one of them. The other question here, and I think I know it's probably going to be a similar answer, are there any guidelines coming out of Ottawa on how tariffs should be indicated on invoices? So we're hearing that some are including it as it's just included in the cost, and others are doing a separate breakout. when they're invoicing their clients, whether that be to a wholesaler or to a contractor. Are there any firm guidelines on how that should be reflected from a billing perspective to the end user?
I'm hearing a lot from people in the construction sector that they're starting to build that into agreements and starting to build that into discussions with customers, and that the best practice that's out there is for different, whether it's contractors or manufacturers or anybody in the whole supply chain, to talk to customers about, hey, how are we going to deal with this jointly? So yeah, I've been exposed to that through our work with the Construction Association and others. So I think that's ultimately the best practice is to have that dialogue. And then the legalities of how that gets passed through gets a little bit more complicated depending on contractual obligations.
And just to build on that, from a manufacturer perspective, I've heard that repeatedly, where customers and manufacturers are coming together to have those type of conversations, and they're doing it on a case-by-case basis with the different nuances depending on what the situation is. They've also engaged legal resources, as well as try to engage with government departments if necessary, if they need some interpretation on different guidelines that are impacted by a particular government as well. So it's a very fluid situation. I know a couple other sectors are thinking about maybe developing their own guidelines and seeing how to try to give broad-based guidance, but that is still very much early in development.
Sandy,
Alex,
I have to sign off, Sandy. I've got a hard stop with another
okay,
webinar starting at 3.
I understand that, and we are going to wrap up in like 1 minute. What I would say to people who are still on the call who have questions, please feel free to send them to me, to Martin, or to Perry, and we will follow these up. Watch the newsletter on a regular basis, because we are trying to take some of these generic issues that impact a lot of people and try and get them on the newsletter on Fridays. Here's one, though, Alex, that we have heard regularly, and I just maybe be curious of the Chamber's perspective. So contracts that were signed previously, so jobs that were awarded, and now all of a sudden there's tariff costs on particular products. Any recommendations coming out of the Chamber as to how to deal with those? Should they just automatically be passed along, or is it truly down to the language in the original contract around specific issues like taxes and such?
It comes down to the language in the contract. It's not something so much where it's automatically passed on. There's different nuances with different agreements and different arrangements that have taken place between different sectors and different stakeholders. What I would say is I personally haven't heard of passed on costs at this point. That is to say, though, it might not happen in the future. So it's a very nimble and evolving situation.
Can I just add,
Okay.
I believe in part that's what the remissions process is aimed at solving too, though we don't know yet how lengthy that process will be. It might not provide anything like the kind of relief that people are looking for in the short term. But I believe it's meant to cover some of these concerns as well.
And at the Canadian Chamber, Martin, just to build on that, we've been calling for speeding up the remissions process for many companies that have went through that, because we've heard from members that sometimes for previous processes it took up to 6 months to get approval for remissions requests. So that is something that I know Global Affairs and Finance Canada have said that they're aware of it, and they're trying to look at different options to try to speed that up.
There are a few questions remaining. I've made notes of them. We will circle back again, either directly or in our newsletter on those. And once again, if you have a specific question, send it to me, Martin, or Perry, and we'll get back to you. Alex, you look like you had one further thing to say.
No, I was just gonna say I have to hop off as well.
Yeah, we're losing people, so we're gonna wrap this up. So Matt, back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for this call. We're going to do these as the issue evolves. I do want to thank ORAC, again, Ontario Refrigeration and Air Conditioning Contractors Association, for, as you can see, co-sponsoring this. We will follow up on those questions. Martin, thank you so much again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again next time. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.